Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day, and today we will be talking about the Civil War in the West. Our first vocab word is unconditional surrender. It is a surrender in which no guarantees are given to the surrendering party, to give up and get nothing in return. This puts the enemy in a much weaker position. Unconditional and immediate surrender. This is Ulysses S. Grant. Back in the olden days when surrendering in a battle or a war, the surrendering army would often negotiate the terms of surrender. For example, they might promise to give the surrendering army something for surrendering, or promise not to hurt or torture them, or the main reason for negotiating terms, the commanding officers most of the times wanted to get the best conditions or make the best situation for his soldiers. So, there was an instance in the Civil War where Grant won a battle, and when the losing commander realized that he couldn't win the battle, he surrendered and sent someone out to negotiate terms of the surrender to Grant. And Grant said, no terms, unconditional and immediate surrender, or basically I'll annihilate you. So, because Grant did this, and this was never ever done, he became this huge war hero. When the people in the North heard about it, they were like, did you hear what Grant did? Unconditional surrender. So, there were other times in the war where Grant was gracious to the army that he beat, especially at the end of the war. When Lee surrendered, he made them turn in most of their weapons, but he let them keep their pistols, and he gave them 3 days worth of food, and he let them keep any personal animals that they had brought with them, mainly horses. So he wasn't always like that, but he became famous for that. All right, War in the West. After Bull Run, war in the East became slowed down, and they focused on building up strength and training their troops. So the action shifted to the West. Now remember, the Northern strategy, they had three things: blockade all Southern ports, capture Richmond, and gain control of the Mississippi River. Now, if they gained control of the Mississippi River, this would split the Confederacy in half, and it would make their transportation very difficult. And a lot of the food that supplied the Southern Army was grown west of the Mississippi River in Texas and Louisiana, and if they cut the use of the Mississippi River for the Confederates, they would have a harder time feeding their army as well. So, to gain control of the Mississippi River, the Union would launch its attack from Cairo, Illinois. Now, this was a key spot because Cairo was where the Mississippi River right here and the Ohio River right here met. And the Ohio River branches off into the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River right here. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was put in charge of the operations at Cairo. Now, let's talk about Grant. Let's do a little background on Grant. Grant grew up in kind of a well-to-do family. His father was a tanner, meaning that he had a business that dealt with leather products. And his father realized at an early age that Ulysses would never be a businessman, so his father decided that he was going to try to get him a career in the military. So when he was old enough, he got him an appointment to West Point, which was the military college that trained the United States Army officers. Well, he got him in, and Ulysses hated it. And he was at the bottom of his class, but he did graduate. Now, an ideal job for Grant would have been in the cavalry, because he was really, really good with horses, and that would have been something that he would have loved. But no, they made him a quartermaster, and a quartermaster is somebody who takes care of all the supplies, and if anybody needs something, they go to the quartermaster. Well, he ended up fighting in the Mexican-American War, and he knew all the, he got to meet a lot of people, and a lot of the officers from the South he knew because of the time that he served with them in the Mexican War and in other areas. After the Mexican-American War, he was shipped out west. And while he was out west, he tried his hand at business and started a couple of businesses, and they both failed. So his father was right about his business sense. Well, he got so depressed, and he was away from his family, and he had failed businesses, that he started drinking, and the drinking became a problem, and he ended up getting kicked out of the Army. So he kind of had a hard time of it for a while. He didn't really know what he wanted to do. He went and worked for his father for a little bit, but at one point he was like one step away from being homeless. He actually went out in the woods and cut trees down and cut wood up and tried to sell wood. He was struggling when he was out of the Army. And then the Civil War broke out, and most of the good officers, most of the good West Point graduates went with the South. And the North needed people from West Point, and Grant was a West Point graduate, so he signed up, and they took him back and gave him a command. So the Battle of Belmont was his first command back, and he won that battle, so people started to notice, so they started giving him a little more responsibility. He started working his way up. So there's the background on Grant. Okay, now let me go back one slide. You can see right here on this map, down the Tennessee River here, you have Fort Henry, and there's a little strip of land across here and along the Cumberland River. There's a Fort Donnelson. Now, this is in Tennessee, and both of these are Confederate forts. So the first thing Grant was going to do, they were going to go down and take these forts. Here's a blow-up of that map. Here's Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and here's Fort Donnelson on the Cumberland River. So in February 1862, Grant was ordered to move against General Sidney Johnston in Kentucky and Tennessee. Now, let's talk about Johnston for a little bit. Now, Johnston could have been the best general in the war, both sides. When I taught this in class, I talked about who was the best basketball player in the world at this time, and a lot of the kids said LeBron James. And if we looked at LeBron James, he started out in Cleveland, and when he went to Cleveland, they were no good, and they started going to the championship game every year. They didn't win it. He didn't win it in Cleveland, but they went there every year. And then he moved on to the Miami Heat, and the 4 years he spent at the Miami Heat, he went to the championship all 4 years, and they won it twice. And then he left, and then while he was gone, Cleveland didn't do anything. So then he went back to Cleveland, his first year back in Cleveland, and now they're in the playoffs again, and they're about ready to win their first playoff series, and the Miami Heat are horrible. So my point is, Sidney Johnston was the LeBron James of generals. He was good, and you did not want to go against him, but you wanted him on your side. So he was who Grant was going to go against. Well, on February 6, 1862, Grant helped by Admiral Andrew Foote and a fleet of ironclads, and they're showing the ironclads right here. There were 7 of them. Captured Fort Henry at Tennessee. So the ironclads went down the Tennessee River. Grant ran around the land and surrounded Fort Henry, and they got bombarded by all sides, and they were taken. So 10 days later, he marched across the little strip there and captured Fort Donnelson on the Cumberland River. And he did the same thing. While he was going across land, the boats went up the river and around the other side. They surrounded Fort Donnelson. And this time, the Confederate commander realized he was trapped, and he asked for Grant's terms. Well, you guys know the answer. Grant's reply was no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. So Grant, because he did this, becomes this huge, huge hero. Now the public was fickle because he'd be a hero one minute and then they'd be calling for Grant to be fired the next minute even though he'd win battles. So Lincoln didn't really listen to the public in this matter, and he liked the way Grant was because Grant was a fighting general. So these victories secured the Tennessee River and more of the Mississippi, and remember their goal is to take control of the whole Mississippi in the South. And it drove the rebels out of Kentucky. Now that was key because remember, Kentucky was a border state, and a border state were the slave states that stayed with the North. And these rebels that were in Kentucky were trying to agitate Kentucky into seceding and going with the South. So when they drove them out of Kentucky, that took that pressure off. So conquering these 2 forts on these rivers opened up a path for the Union troops to march down through to Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. All right, the Battle of Shiloh. Now, on April 6, a couple of months later, in 1862, Grant came down the Tennessee River with 40,000 troops and stopped at a place called Vicksburg Landing. And there were more Union troops on the way from Nashville, but nobody really knew where they were. And you got to keep in mind that back in these days they had no technology, so these reinforcements, these 25,000 reinforcements that were coming, they didn't know exactly when they were going to get there. There's no way they could communicate back and forth. The only thing they could do is they knew how far Nashville was, and they knew how fast the army could move, so they could make an educated guess, but you know, who knows what they were going to see on the way, how long would the fighting slow them down, so they weren't exactly sure when they would get there. But they knew they were on their way. So the Southern generals at Shiloh were Albert Sidney Johnston, LeBron James, and P.G.T. Beauregard, and they had 44,000 troops. Now they were back across the border in Corinth, Mississippi. Now Johnston decided to launch a surprise attack on the Union troops at Vicksburg Landing before the 25,000 reinforcements can come. Now they knew where Grant was because they had spies out here and they knew that the reinforcements were coming. So they decided to attack before they came. And they launched their sneak attack. Now, this ended up being some of the most bitter and bloody fighting of the war, and Grant's army was not ready for this attack. They were surprised. So, the first day, the Confederates drove Grant all the way back to the Tennessee River, so they all retreated. And During their retreat, the Union soldiers settled in an area along a small, little used farm road. And they ended up naming this area the Hornet's Nest. Well, this area was called the Hornet's Nest because the Confederates made repeated attacks against it, like 11 of them, all day long. And the Union Army in this area, they called it the Hornet's Nest because there were so many bullets flying, and every time they flew by it sounded like hornets buzzing. So the defense of the Hornet's Nest was key because it held back the Confederates long enough for Grant, the rest of Grant's army, to regroup and set up defenses back here on the bluffs above Pittsburgh's Landing. So the Hornet's Nest, a lot of people lost their lives on both sides here, but they did help out Grant's army to get set up. If they wouldn't have done that, the Confederates would have gotten to Grant sooner and probably won the battle pretty easily. There was one bad thing that happened in this battle. Albert Sidney Johnston was mortally wounded, and he died at Shiloh. Now, this was devastating for the South. He was their best general. He was the best general in the war. Now, the reason Johnston was so good at being a general was because whenever he could, he would go out in the field and lead his troops from his horse. Most of the major generals stayed away from the action. It was important for these major generals, these leaders, these officers to stay alive because they were the ones who were trained to win the war, win the battles. And they were trained in the strategy, and they knew how to move the troops, and they knew what to do when certain things happened. They were able to adjust. And if these guys died, then you were going to lose the battle. So the way most of them worked was they were back behind the lines, and they had a map in front of them, and messengers would come to them and tell them what to do, and then they would send messages back, and they would make adjustments. And this was not as good because things happened slower, and what if the messages were wrong or whatever? Well, Johnston liked to be closer to the action where he could actually see what was going on, and then he could make adjustments immediately, and it was much more effective. But the problem was it was more dangerous, and if you got too close to the action, you risked dying, and that's what happened to him. So during the afternoon of this first day, Johnston was in the field on his horse directing his troops, and he was hit in the back of the knee. And he checked it, and it didn't seem that bad. He looked down, he didn't really see it bleeding that bad, and he sent the doctor away and asked him to go help soldiers that were more serious, and there were a lot of them. Well, what he didn't realize was that the bullet had hit an artery, and maybe it didn't start bleeding right away, but it eventually ruptured, and he looked down, and he didn't see any blood. Well, he was wearing really high boots, and he bled basically inside his boot, and in under an hour he bled to death. So had he taken care of it when it happened, he probably would have survived. So after his death, Beauregard took over and made a decision that probably cost them the battle. So he was looking around the battlefield, and he saw how dominant they had been that day, and they'd pushed the Yankees all the way back to the Tennessee River, and it looked like they were about to win the battle. And he saw that his soldiers were tired because they'd been fighting all day, so he chose to pull back when it got dark and finish it in the morning and be on their merry way. Well, this may have saved the North, because had Johnston survived, the Confederates probably would have fought into the night and won the battle on the first day before the Northern reinforcements had arrived. Well, by morning, the 25,000 Union reinforcement had arrived, and the next day they defeated the Confederates. The Confederates withdrew back to Corinth, Mississippi. They pursued them there, and they ended up defeating them there as well. So both armies had combined casualties of 20,000 men, 20,000 casualties. So it was a pretty devastating battle. All right, so the Union took Corinth, Mississippi. Then they went on to take Memphis, Tennessee, right on the Mississippi River. And on April 25th, 1862, the Union Navy under Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans, Louisiana. This is Farragut. Went down and captured New Orleans. So they started working their way up the Mississippi. Well, Grant started working his way down the Mississippi, and it took him a year, but he captured Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863, and I thought it was interesting that it was July 4th again. Now, Vicksburg was the last thing that he had to conquer on the Mississippi to take total control of it. And Vicksburg was a big fortress city that sat on bluffs above the Mississippi, and they pointed their cannons down at the river. So the Union couldn't use this river until they conquered Vicksburg, and it took them a long time. But they finally did it. And then once they did, this gave the Union the control of the Mississippi after 2 long years of fighting. So they achieved their goal. So they've pretty much achieved 2 war goals after 2 years. They blockaded all the southern ports, and this hurt the South. It cut their trade by 2/3, and then they took control of the Mississippi. This was called the Anaconda Plan, and as you know, anacondas squeeze their prey, and that's what the North was trying to do to the South. All right, here is your notebook. I want you to finish the guided reading activity 16-2, and I want you to look at this map of the Western campaigns, and I want you to list the Union victories that happened in 1862 and 1863 in order. So start up here at Fort Henry and Fort Donnelson and just kind of work your way down. And your writing is to tell the story of the Battle of Shiloh. Okay, like the other articles, put a headline in first, and then your date and place. Talk about the strengths of the North and the South. The North had 65,000 men. Remember, Grant came with 40, and then there were 25,000 reinforcements. And the North was commanded by Grant. South was commanded by Johnston and Beauregard, and they had 44,000 troops. And they decided to surprise attack Grant before his reinforcements could arrive. They retreated to the Hornet's Nest, and the significance of the Hornet's Nest was that it held the Confederates off long enough for Grant to set up new defenses. Johnson died at Shiloh, and this was devastating for the South, and it probably saved the North, because had Johnston lived, he probably would have finished the battle that night, and Beauregard chose not to. This allowed the reinforcements to get there the next day, and then they won the battle. So then do a Google search on casualties like we've been doing, and list the casualties for both armies. I really want to know how many died in this battle on both sides combined. Well, that's the Battle of Shiloh, and that's the war in the West, kids. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.